Looking at quadratic equations, right? And we're going to talk about what it looks like in standard form and also what the quadratic strategy looks like, right? So in general, I'm going to work through a series of things, and when I talk about quadratic strategy, is firstly, we have equations, we're dealing with a section that deals with algebra, and the first part of the quadratic strategy is I want to not work with fractions, right? So no a over b. Secondly, we don't want any roots or any square roots, okay? I'm going to put over there no square roots. And so you need to get rid of fractions using the LCD, you need to get rid of square roots by squaring both sides after you've isolated the root. And then thirdly, you want to put it into standard form, and that's something we're going to look at now. What does standard form look like, right? And finally, you either factorize or you use the quadratic formula. Okay? Or use the formula. Okay, so let's talk about what the standard form of quadratic equation looks like. The standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c is equivalent or equal to 0. Okay, and so if you want to solve the quadratic equation, this equal to 0 is very important, right? Because only once it's equal to 0 can we factorize and then apply what we call the zero product property. And I'm going to show you examples of that. So before I continue, I'm going to, so I've shown you the standard form, and let's just label that. We are talking about standard form of quadratic equation, right? Okay, standard form of a quadratic equation. Then over here, we're going to talk about the zero product property, and that basically says if a times b is equal to 0, that implies that either a is equal to 0 or b is equal to 0. Okay, and as you can see, that's factor a and factor b, which means it's something multiplied by another thing, right? That's going to be very important when we look at it. Okay. Okay, so let's apply this formula and let's look at the first example of a quadratic equation, right? So I'm going to give you something that looks like this: x squared is equal to x. Now, this is one that we look at grade 12 level and grade 11 level, and people often make a mistake by dividing both sides by x. Okay, so if I look at this example, we want to try and work towards standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. And standard form has this equal to 0 part in it. That doesn't look like standard form, right? Because the x itself could be 0. So let's get everything on one side. That's going to give me x squared minus x is equal to 0. That's what we really want. Okay. Now we can factorize. Always check for a common factor first. And this is now in the standard form. The values of a for this equation is a equals 1. In front of the x, we have the b value, which is b is equal to negative 1. And the c value over here is equal to 0, right? Because there's no c value, so therefore the value of c is 0. So once it's in a standard form where I've worked towards equaling 0, I now want to factorize this. And you can try factoring it first. The common factor is x. X times what gives me x squared once again, that is x. And x times what gives me negative x, that's basically negative 1, is equal to 0. Okay, so now here's where the zero product property comes in. That's my first factor. That's like looking at a, and that's like looking at the second factor, which we can call b, right? So either the first factor, x is equal to 0, or the second factor, x minus 1 is equal to 0. From x minus 1 equal to 0, we can clearly see that x has to equal to positive 1. What must I put in x? That's such that I subtract 1 from it and I get 0. That's going to be positive 1 minus 1 gives me 0. X equals 1. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at a common error in which learners look at the same problem. Right. So you're given x squared is equal to x. Often learners want to divide simply both sides by x. So they divide this by x and they divide that by x. And you can see x divided by x is 1 and x squared divided by x is x. That is not entirely incorrect, and neither is it entirely correct. because here I've got a solution of x equals 1, but I've only got one solution. And when I look at the previous example, when we worked this out, we needed to have a solution of x equals 0 or x equals 1. And here I've got two solutions. Okay? So the correct way to do it is to work towards what we call the standard form and ensure that we factorize or use the formula rather than dividing by x. Because we don't know, x could possibly be 0. If x was not equal to 0, then we can divide by x. But could be equal to 0, which means that if I divide by x and x is actually 0, this entire equation becomes undefined. So that's the first example of quadratic equation.